Thank you, Anita. Well, it's great to have Raghu here, and thanks everybody for coming. Why don't we start with the book, which, if you don't have it already, the third pillar. I take it the first two pillars are the market and the state, and there's some controversy, or should the state be considered a pillar? Why should community be considered the third pillar? Or tell us your main thesis of your book.
So the book starts with the observation that the system that brought us prosperity since World War II, probably the most beneficial system for humanity, the liberal market democracy, is under severe pressure, right? So 3 words: liberal, market, democracy. I think the liberal stands in many ways for a state that is limited, but is expansive, protects the right of people to speak their mind, so to speak. Markets, we know what markets are. And democracy is really the third part of this equilibrium, the part which is supported by strong communities, and which keeps the system working, which keeps capitalism afloat in some sense. And what I argue in the book is that the system is not working as advertised, in part because it's suffered from a huge shock, which is the technological revolution we're going through, which affects every element of this equilibrium, partly by changing the nature of economies, changing the nature of jobs, but also creating an integration across the world of markets, which puts tremendous pressure. We can talk about that as we go through. So the technological revolution is a shock, and in response to the technological revolution, the element of the 3 words I talked about, the liberal market democracy, and especially the community surrounding democracy, that's the one that has responded most weakly to the shock. And we can go into the reasons why it has not been able to respond. But as a result, we have a whole segments of countries being left behind. And this is not just, we've been through many seminars where we talk about middle-income jobs disappearing. That's well known. But it's also that a whole variety of places in different countries are falling behind relative to the rest. Today, industrial countries have a serious problem of underdevelopment. Many places in these countries are really closer to second and third world countries rather than to first world countries.
Is that different than shocks we've been through before?
It's similar to big shocks that we've been through, and we've adjusted. So the first industrial revolution, the second industrial revolution. Think about let's talk about the second industrial revolution, which happened towards the latter part of the 19th century. We had a whole new set of technologies coming up, the automobile, chemical plants. To man these factories that produced these new products, you needed a whole different workforce, a workforce which was much better educated than the workforce of old. You needed people who knew trigonometry and algebra. And the response that we had then was the high school movement, which educated a whole variety of people up to the demands of the new technology. And it's interesting because there was an immigration issue then also, if you remember, around the turn of the century, many people from Europe coming into the United States. And a lot of these new workers were really very skilled in the old jobs. They knew how to do plumbing. They knew how to do carpentry. But they didn't really know trigonometry or algebra. So the native-born children were much more adept at getting these jobs in the factories than the immigrants. So there was an immigration, there was a fight over immigration even then, but it was resolved by the native-born going to get better skills. That's not happening today in this country.
Could you have written this book? So this shock, the technology shock, and the hollowing out of the middle and the places that are left behind, kind of feels like that's been going since the late 70s, the 1980s, the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s. Why is it only bubbling up now?
Well, it's a process, right? And you're absolutely right that the job losses, the hollowing out of the middle has been happening for some time. There are obviously straws that break the camel's back or triggers that set off some of these big concerns. I think the trigger that set it off across the industrial world was in many ways the global financial crisis and the Great Recession. Not that it was the centerpiece, but the kind of malaise it created, as well as the distrust in the elite. Finally, there was a widespread sense that here are guys, people like you and me, who've been preaching about this is the way to go. We need an open world. We need free trade. We need an independent central bank. All these things. And yet, they took us into the financial crisis. Do they really know?
Right.
And more important, can we trust them? Are they going to do the right thing by us?
Now, in the U.S. perspective, we often have a kind of an insular thing and haven't seen the experiences of populism, of strongmen, of whatever, taking over in leadership. But in lots of parts of emerging markets and around the world, they have. And it didn't, the reason we haven't tried some of those policies is not that nobody thought of them before, it's that when they did them, they ended terribly. Are there not lessons to the U.S. or to the advanced countries here now going the other way from whether it's Latin America, whether it's parts of Asia that engaged in these, and the pathologies that those policies ended up there? Would that not lead to the same pathologies if applied here?
No, look, I think the problem in situations like this is people have been listening to the establishment in the past.
Yeah.
And the establishment has the same old answers once again. Yes, you need to get education, we need to work on that. As you know, every American president since Gerald Ford has been the education president. And we haven't made much of a difference there, right? So you have the same old sort of answers being trotted out, and it's not working. And so at that point they say, well, can it be really that bad if we vote for this other guy who's promising that he'll solve everything with a few tariffs here and there, and he's going to fix it for us, or at least he says. At the worst, what he'll do is poke an eye in this establishment which has become too comfortable. And that itself is a good thing. And if his policies work, even better. Now,
okay, but now say they don't. That's what I'm asking. So to win a protest election, let's call it, it happened in many countries after the financial crisis, including ones that are very homogenous and haven't had a big increase in inequality. In Iceland,
right,
a comedian wins
Ukraine,
and takes over.
absolutely.
And now in the Ukraine.
Yeah.
So it's always then, well, then now what? Okay, the guy's like, I'm going to stick it in their face.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, now they're elected.
Right.
If the policies don't work, then what happens? Does it just deepen the mistrust and it spirals worse?
Well, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying this is the way out. I do think we need a different set of policies, but I'm not saying that the policies some of these populist nationalist leaders bring to the table are the way out. But they offer, a couple of comforting things. One, it's not the policies of the old, the tried and tested and failed policies. It's different. So there is some premium for trying something different. The old stuff doesn't work, at least let me vote for something that is different. But second, there's something else that they offer, which it's not about economics. It's a sense of identity, a sense of status.
Right.
The nationalism that many of them sort of offer is in many ways a substitute for the community identity that used to be stronger earlier. When you're in a community that is breaking down and you're looking around and there's nothing that you can feel proud of, and there's somebody who comes in and says, look, we're for this kind of nation and this is our proud history and you're part of this, they're offering an alternative imagined community. This is what Hannah Arendt talked about when she talked about the underpinnings of the rise of Nazism. I'm not saying it's the same thing.
Yes.
History never repeats. But there is a sense in which broken communities lead to a search for alternatives, or slipping communities. We are slipping. Somebody who reasserts our strength, our past power, our past status, and tells us we're going to be great again. So there is a lot of appeal in that, and especially if you can say the problem is not you, the problem is them.
Okay, and so I was going to ask you, if there is one group, not primarily economists, but a lot of economists are in the group that views, let's call it economic determinism, that it's economics that explains everything, and that if you see this rise of the populist protest vote, it must be because wages have been getting squeezed. There's a different view, which is not really economic in nature, it's about racial resentments or ethnic identities, and we don't like immigrants, and we don't like people of color, and we don't like that women's social status and economic status has risen, and that's sort of the motivator of this whole thing. And if you buy into that view, then it seems maybe almost quaint to say, we have to figure out how to get wages up, we have to figure out how to do these things. Is your feeling that critique of the economic determinist position is flawed because if we really could raise wages, it would make them less angry, and that we would get less of the cultural and identity battles?
I think it's a mix. I don't think it's only economics. I don't think it's only social. And what's interesting is you see the economists running regressions and saying, no, it's the
right.
it's the conditions there, it's the China effect,
Right.
the loss of jobs, and then you have a sociologist coming in and saying, hey, this guy who earns 150,000 still has those views.
Right.
So it's not the economics, it's something different. It's a mix, and in fact they feed on each other, and that's the thing that is very interesting. William Junius Wilson was a sociologist who looked at black communities and asked the question, why is there social breakdown in the black urban communities, especially communities, for example, in Chicago? And his view was, this happened after civil rights. And he said, this is nothing to do with slavery or the original conditions of the African-American community. They had strong families before civil rights. And so it's hard to imagine that, there was something cultural about it. And he argued that what had gone wrong was the loss of manufacturing jobs in places like Chicago, the steel jobs that were south of the city and so on. The loss of those manufacturing jobs essentially made the African-American male much less of an economic producer because of the traditional jobs going. And he argued that the breakdown of the family started from there.
Spiraled from that.
Spiraled from that because he was no longer seen as a stable economic sort of agent. Marriage became, for example, less attractive. Why would you hitch up to somebody who couldn't provide as much? And that was one factor. The other factor he pointed to was that, ironically, as civil rights took hold, it became possible for the African-American middle class to move out of the areas where they had been restrained, and they left. And that left a weaker community behind. Now, there's no issue of blame here, but it is a fact that because they had opportunities outside, because the good teacher was no longer restricted to teaching in African-American schools and could move out elsewhere and teach elsewhere, there was a loss of middle-class people in the African-American community.
And so you feel like that is in some ways analogous to elite markets, the most productive people are going to move to Silicon Valley or New York City or urban areas and leave those places behind?
I think that is happening in more integrated communities throughout the United States in the last few years. And certainly this whole loss of manufacturing jobs.
Yes.
Now people are tying the loss of manufacturing jobs to the breakdown of the family in those areas, to the, to teenage pregnancies, to opioid addiction. That's related to the economic breakdown, just as William Junius Wilson said happened in the African American community. And what you also see is that the community itself is weakened because, I mean, think about it. If you're a middle-class couple, upper middle-class professional couple in Chicago today, and you're thinking of trying to get the best education for your kids, what are you going to do? Almost invariably, if you want to put your kids in public school and you can't afford a private school, you're going to move to the richest community you can afford, because that's where your kid will be surrounded by other aspiring sort of kids of middle-class couples, and they will have the best chance at an education. And so what you see in the United States is the communities that were more integrated look like they're now morphing into communities that are either communities of more richer people,
Super high,
or
and
poorer
everyone
people,
else. Yeah.
and the middle is disintegrated.
Yeah, right.
And this secession of the successful, again, driven by market forces, because increasingly with technological change, you want a really good education for your kids. That secession of the successful is because we have a meritocracy. But because they're seceding and leaving the others behind, we're getting a hereditary meritocracy.
Right.
And nobody wants a hereditary meritocracy.
Now, this book, some people, I'm sure, when they saw that you were going to be announced, they'd better say, why are you inviting an economist to Chicago Humanities Festival? Economists don't know anything about humanities, and we've been accused of not even being humans. Yet, if you read this book, it's full of history. It's clear you did lots of research outside the normal bounds, let's call it, of the economics profession. How did you come to that? And did you find, how much did you find that coming from the humanities perspective enhanced or changed your thinking about these issues of the market?
Well, you know, I don't know who said this, you probably know. The questions never change, but the answers do, right? and I've had this question ever since I entered the profession. Why does capitalism work? And why does it work in some places and not in others? And, you know, I've been puzzling with this question. I've written 3 books, all sort of trying to get at the answer. I think I've finally got a better answer, but I'm not, you know, you're never sure it's the final answer. But it does seem to me that the importance of democracy to capitalism, the importance of protest to capitalism, to making capitalism work. Remember, one of the early views of capitalism, the book, in fact, the Bible, The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, it wasn't a starry-eyed Ayn Rand view of capitalism. It was basically saying capitalism works, but the temptation of the capitalist is to get together in a back room and to cartelize the whole system. And we need to fight against that. The whole of The Wealth of Nations is, in a sense, a protest against cartelization, a protest against tariffs, an attempt to get markets to work more freely, right? But of course, something has happened to make that work, at least for some time, in the industrial democracies that we have, which have one facet, which wasn't there in Adam Smith's time, which is really a functioning democracy. Yeah. And so part of what I was trying to do was to try and understand what were the links between democracy, markets, and the government. And all of them have morphed over time, trying to understand why they morphed and why this equilibrium sometimes works and what sort of causes it to break apart. So yes, I did a lot of reading. I learned a lot, I hope. And then trying to put the pieces together. So this book is a result of that. I think the point that I'm trying to make also is that this liberal market democracy is not a menu. Yeah. You can't pick one piece of it. I want democracy, but I don't want markets. I would challenge you to find any country in the world that is truly democratic, but doesn't have markets, doesn't have free markets. Pick any socialist country and tell me, I would challenge you to tell me it's a functioning democracy. It's very hard. because there aren't any. Why does democracy and markets, why do they go together? What is the role of markets in limiting the power of the state to allow for the liberalism that we think is very important in our societies today? So it's an attempt to get at the equilibrium and to also ask, why is it going wrong? Because I think one of the greatest benefits of capitalism is opportunity, broad opportunity. And that's not happening today. We need to figure out why and worry about rectifying it.
Now, the theme, as you know, of the Humanities Festival this year is power. And so they asked that we ask a question about power. So maybe I will ask the following question. In an environment with democracy like the one in the United States especially, where a lot of the democratic power is derived from money, how do you deal with, maybe it's right to call it the abuse of power, but the notion that if one group starts gaining wealth, that gives them political power to vote themselves lower taxes or to vote themselves fewer strictures or restrictions, and people are saying, wait a minute, you're getting it all, we're not sharing in the bounty. Are we in an unstable political equilibrium that cannot be merged, or what do we do about that?
We are. I mean, the instability comes from the fact that, democracy, forget the money power for a moment, democracy gives everyone a vote, regardless of how wealthy they are. And if you have overly concentrated opportunity, but it's people by and large aren't able to access that, then it creates a dysfunction. It creates a disequilibrium. If some of you who know history in the audience recollect the big populist movement in the late 19th century in the United States was essentially driven by farmers who, had bought land. There were droughts and crop failures, etc. But they were really angry because they were being squeezed over a barrel by two big forces: the cartelized railways, which charged them huge rates to transport the fertilizer and transport away their grain, and second, the banks, which they felt were charging them extraordinarily high interest rates. And these were banks back east. And the populist movement was in many ways a anti-monopoly, anti-power movement. But interestingly, it was also against corruption. One of the biggest things that the railways did was they bought entire legislatures by the simple act of giving everybody in the legislature a free pass, a free seasonal pass, go anywhere you want, and they bought the entire legislature on that basis. So there was a lot of corruption in the United States at that time. The populist movement was essentially a movement of the powerless, saying, we want a break on the power of big corporations. We want less corruption in government. We want more transparency. One of the things they called for was direct election of senators. That was one of their big demands. The net result of this populist movement was they got some of what they asked for: antitrust. The Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890 was, in many ways, a result of the populists. But they had long-lasting influence because what followed the populist movement, when they sort of were satisfied and went back, to their farms, the progressive movement took off. And amongst the things the progressive movement gave us was a variety of regulations. The Food and Drug Administration, in many ways, was an outcrop of the progressive movement. The Federal Reserve came from that movement. So to your point that, yes, there are imbalances that build up, but there are also popular reactions. And so I view protest as a good thing if channeled in the right way. And if it can move the system to re-examining itself, to cleaning the swamp genuinely, and making sure there is broader opportunity, it's doing what it's supposed to do: rectify the system.
In a way, it's funny because the first round of populism plus progressivism, which was a reaction to a huge technology shock, resulted in, let's call it meritocratic, technocrat leadership. And so their ideas, a lot of the progressive ideas were, let's have a central bank that's not run by politicians. And let's have city councils that are elected directly without a party. And let's have a city manager, and let's do those. And now we have a new technology shock generating populism, but it feels like it's in direct revolt against. Let's not have a bunch of technocrats in charge of it. Let's go back to a more politically run thing.
Well, I think this goes back to your earlier question. I think this is a phase. I suspect unless the leaders have answers, at some point, if they don't have answers to the problems, and I sincerely believe they don't, we will see a disillusionment. Yes, we tried the alternative, it doesn't work. That doesn't mean they'll go back to the old establishment.
Yeah, right.
But there will be new people who will say, I have a different solution. And here, why don't you listen to me? And that, to my mind, is a necessary change that we need to have.
Now let's take while we have you here, let's also take a rapid tour around the world. And maybe our first transition point will be these issues of nationalism, of populism, and things like that. Yes, they characterize our politics in the US, but it feels like if we look, say, at India, you got a whole thing going on in India and in other emerging markets, but help us understand what the forces are, what's the dynamic that's going on in India, this rise of nationalism, and where does it go, and what do you see for the economy?
It's interesting because similar effects are playing out in a country like India also. You see the loss of the old jobs in the villages. You see a migration away into the cities. You see people who've left their traditional communities no longer have a new sense of community. And you find the populist nationalists are saying, hey, I have something for you, which is, in India, is more of a religious nationalism, the Hindu right party, which portrays this view of, you're part of the larger Hindu family. And that's attractive for somebody who's left their village, feels deracinated. They see all this change happening in the cities. They want to be part of something. And this nationalism offers them a chance to be part of it, right? And, sometimes this appeal even trumps the economic side. What we've had over the last 5 years in India is modest economic improvement, but one of the biggest concerns is there are not enough jobs for the people leaving agriculture. So there's a huge hunger for good jobs, just as there are in industrial countries. And one of the appeals of the current government in the election that is being fought is they moved away from talking about economics. It's almost entirely about national security and nationalism, and you're part of this great Indian movement, and that, to my mind, can work for some time, but it offers a missing piece that people are looking for. But unless you also fix the economics, it is not.
It won't fix that. Okay, then moving up to China. How do you, in your mind, fit? One worldview is China's massively overloaded with debt. The government has been trying in every way to stimulate, either directly through government stimulus or indirectly through credit markets, and that they're in a way in deep trouble. And as they slow down, and if the world slows down, they're going to have a huge overhang, and it's much worse than people think. And then there's a counter narrative, which is, no, look, it's basically fine. Yeah, they have some issues with debt, but if you compare debt ratios to GDP, total debt is definitely lower than the United States or other advanced countries. And so we shouldn't be that nervous about it. It's kind of a natural progression as they shift from manufacturing and exports to more service-based and domestic. As between those two, Do you have a view?
Well, I talk a little bit about China in the book. I said the book in the first part is about how this good equilibrium came about, and the middle part is what's breaking down, and in the emerging markets like China and India are part of that story. I mean, to my mind, today China has risen so fast and so quickly. It is seen as a threat to the United States, and that's part of why we have this trade tussle. But it's beyond trade. It's about strategic supremacy in the world. There's enormous concern that the Chinese acquisition of new technologies, for example, in artificial intelligence and so on, is a direct threat because those are the technologies of the defense forces of the future, and that's something that the United States wants to protect against. But I think there's another issue with China beyond the debt, and the debt is something which has built up as a result of this issue, which is the Chinese Communist Party acquires its legitimacy from having really performed very well for the nation over the last years since 1980 when they really set off their reforms. But because they don't have periodic elections, that legitimacy needs to constantly be maintained. It's what have you done for me lately is what the people are asking, and the party has to show it has produced growth. Now that actually puts it in a much more difficult situation than democracies.
Right.
You can always say the old guy messed up, the last guy messed up, and that's his problem. I'm just trying to pick up the pieces. As every administration does, right? It was the old guys who messed up. They can't do that because the old guys are themselves. The Communist Party has been there in power for a long, long time. And if you blame the previous guys, you risk delegitimizing the Communist Party. So in a sense, they can't afford serious downturns because their source of legitimacy is precisely their competence. Which means when you see a sign of slowing, you see a sign that the jobs aren't as plentiful as in the past. Remember, Tiananmen Square happened when there was a lot of youth unemployment. Graduates from universities weren't finding jobs, and they started protesting. They're very worried about that loss of legitimacy, which is why the temptation was every time it slowed, you'd ramp up the stimulus, tell the banks to go out and lend, start huge new construction projects, reduce the taxation on housing so that house prices would go up, and you'd restart the boom.
Yeah.
Well, they've had a constant boom for the last 40 years, and it's now tiring. And the only way they can restart more of it is through yet more credit, yet more debt, and they realize that that is a situation which has to come to an end. You can't keep piling it up. The debt to GDP overall is 270% of GDP, of which something like 170 lies in the private sector and the local government vehicles. So they have built up a lot of debt. So that's one problem. How do you get away from this? If you really want to be a market economy, you have to let the Communist Party give up power. The word power again. That is much harder for them to do because, the Chinese system is the Communist Party running the system. So my sense is this is going to become yet more challenging in the future. When you're in frontier industries, when you have responsibility for overall growth and you find that you've made mistakes, how can you fess up to those mistakes?
Yeah.
That's why I said the liberal market democracy was a great equilibrium. It's what promotes a lot of innovation. The Chinese say they can still innovate, and they will for some time. And they've got great private sector firms. But the temptation will be to go more into them, to meddle with them, to intervene in them, to try and keep growth going according to the party view. That, I think, will eventually slow them down.
Okay, we got just a couple minutes, and we're going to turn to questions from the audience. Let's complete our world tour by landing in Europe. Now, Raghu's I'm not going to put him on the spot. You may have seen the rumors that he's on the short list to be the head of the Bank of England. So I'm not going to ask you about that, but I am going to ask you about Europe. The European Central Bank has had a view pretty different than the view taken by the Fed. Maybe you could characterize as austerity. In the event you start running deficits, you get into debt problems, go cut spending. Now we're in this nether period or something where they know they don't want to do that. We've gone through we'll do whatever it takes to prevent a deflation and a collapse. But if you look at individual countries, whether they be Greece or Italy or maybe Spain or maybe the UK, they have poor demographics, they have poor debt to GDP ratios to start. They look like they're coming up with the opposite of fiscal discipline. Can they get out of their problems, or is all of Europe Greece?
Look, I think if you talk to the committed Europeans, they will talk about the idea of Europe. That is extremely important. And they will say, I'll tell you a story which sort of intrigued me. In 2012, right? Remember, there were two big issues going on in the developed world. One was the fear that the U.S. would default on its debt.
Yeah.
And the other was the fear that Europe would break apart, right? Both were pretty significant fears. When I talked to the Europeans, they said, we'll fix the European problems. It's the US we're worried about because the US is going to do something really bad because Washington is all fractured. And when you talk to the US, it was, we'll fix the debt problem. We're not going to default. There's no chance. But it's the Europeans we're worried about. And that actually tells a story that the people had much more confidence in their part, even whatever the mess looked outside, that when push came to shove, in that last desperate weekend, they'll bring things together. And I think that confidence still exists somewhat in Europe, despite Brexit, despite some of the rhetoric that comes from Italy. That, we need to let some of these pressures out. But in general, the idea of Europe still holds because collectively we're much stronger and more formidable a force in the world. Individually, nobody pays attention to us. And so in that sense, I think that idea will prevail. How much money people are willing to put behind it still remains to be questioned. At the center of this is Germany, of course. And a lot revolves around how much Germany is willing to put out in order to keep Europe together. The Germans, if you ask them, will again say we will do what it takes, but we need other people to do their bit. Of course, if they say we'll do what it takes right up front, nobody else will do their bit.
Yeah, right.
But there is a sense that there is an idea of Europe we want to go towards. We are pausing right now to let some of these forces play themselves out, but we want to go there.
I see. Okay. Jim, did you want to state the ground rules or how the questions are going to work? It definitely won't work for us to call on you because we can't really see.
So what a fantastic presentation this evening so far. We have a few minutes for questions. If you have something, we'll come to you, so raise your hand and I'll walk to you, and Kelly is on that side. First question.
Thank you. Hi, I had a kind of question. If you go back to what you were saying about kind of the disillusionment of people because of all these shifts. So what do you kind of see now where you see there's the generation that's out of work that's kind of leaning more towards the Trump right, and then you have even my generation who's so fractured in democratic liberalism, you wouldn't think they gave everyone so much shit for saying how the Republicans had 20 different candidates, but our party has a spectrum of them, and kind of explain that disillusionment within that.
Let me leave the politics to Austin, but one of the problems not just in the U.S. but across the industrial world is the fracturing and the demonizing of the other side, right? And when you demonize, it becomes much harder to talk across the aisle. And what do you do about that? And some of the fracturing is because of very different views on the direction, on the economic direction, on the social direction. But I would argue also that it's important to rebuild the sense that the person across is a person, the sense of common humanity, so to speak. And to my mind, that one of the places to start is really rebuilding our sense of community in our communities themselves. Once you understand that the guy across the street is not to be feared, but is part of the community, then to that extent you're willing to cut them some slack as you start talking. I mean, when I bring back the idea of community, people sort of sometimes, especially in cosmopolitan cities, say, well, we outgrew that 50 years ago. That was when we were kids. But in many countries, that sense of community still is really important. When you ask people in the UK, what do you most identify with? It's with their municipality or their town. More than 70% of people in the UK identify with that as who they are. And that sense of identity, that sense of decency, that sense of real people is, to my mind, what we need to bring back. And I would argue that focusing on rebuilding our communities will get us some of that way there, in getting people to have a dialogue, a debate, as opposed to demonizing the other.
We have a question here on the left.
Good evening. Yes, you maybe started to answer my question. I was sitting here feeling that this entire conversation really was about what I guess is being termed the first two pillars. I think, well, what about this third pillar? What do you have to say? What is in your book? And I hope maybe you can tell us a little bit more than that, because, I mean, we can all agree with you on that, but how do you do it? And how is it that we could hope that this conversation will really address our problems? I'd just like to provide a setting to address that in, which is the climate emergency that we face. Thank you.
It's a great question. So let me try and be as brief so that I give time for the last part of the book. The first part is how we got, what the equilibrium looked like, then how we moved away from that and the problems. And the last part is, potential solutions. I very much think the answer is rebuilding from the community up. And the term I use for that is inclusive localism. Localism in the sense of empowering communities. One of the factors, I think, contributing to our problems that I document in the book is, as markets have integrated, power has moved away, the power to do things has moved away from the community to the national government, and from the national government to the international sphere. So there is a lot of disempowerment of, the ability to choose how you live, how you produce, how you work at the local level. And so when I say localism, I'm saying let's push more of that power back. It includes the power to decide on many things, but it also includes the funding to be able to do some of that. So localism is part of it, but localism doesn't mean going back to the old segregated communities of the past. That, to my mind, would defeat the purpose, because it would leave us very poorly positioned for the world of tomorrow. So that's where the inclusive part comes. The communities may have walls around them, but they have to be really low walls. And markets should traverse those walls. The state, which ensures no discrimination, etc., should also be able to traverse those walls. That, to my mind, at the local level, inclusive localism would be very important. That would also allow you, at the local level, to see what policies can we adopt that help us contribute to the issue of big problems like climate change, right? However, as you obviously recognize, it also requires national and international level decisions. I think the wrong way to decide about big issues like climate change is to decide at the international level and then impose it without any democratic participation. If you think about what set off the Gilets jaunes in France, it was precisely this, that they elevated the tax on gasoline, And they also told every community, you cannot speed beyond this limit. This is going to be the national speed limit imposed on you. And that set off people because they said, you're worried about the end of the world, we're worried about the end of the month. We can't make ends meet by the end of the month. You have to cut us some slack. You need to get the people to go along to actually impact big issues like climate change. So we need much more democratic dialogue about how we're going to make a difference. People are increasingly getting worried about it, but they have to be participants rather than have the rules imposed from abroad. So I talk about inclusive localism at the local level, responsible sovereignty at the national level. By all means, take back power into the nation, but use that power responsibly. One of our biggest responsibilities is to ensure the survival of the planet. So we have to use that power, we have to cooperate, but cooperate in a democratic way. I think that is what we need to do.
Question here in the center.
I read one of the problems of China keeping its tight communist control is that today in Bloomberg it said that a lot of Chinese millionaires are leaving the country, or they're trying to get their money out, and China's trying to put currency controls in their country.
I think there is people have gotten very wealthy in China. And one of the problems with some of this wealth, which is a problem in many emerging markets, is what is sometimes called the problem of original sin. That is, in the early days when you were making your money, it wasn't actually legal to make money. In China, for example, you couldn't employ more than 7 people in the early phases of liberalization. And who cared for the rules? People employed 250, 300 people in their factories. So because you broke the rules, if the government doesn't like you, it can always get you on some rules that you transgressed in the past. And so that's a big worry for people of wealth in some of these countries, that they can always be got at if they transgress. And so there is a temptation to get their money out, to get their money, at least some portion, safely. Tremendous amount of buying of houses in Vancouver, in Hong Kong, in London and New York. But there's also been a transference of assets. Now, I don't think that's the central concern of the government, but it does reflect the fact that if they do want to have a healthy entrepreneurial culture, that overhang, that we can take away your money whenever we feel like it, has to be mitigated.
We have a question here in the back.
So you spoke briefly about the decline of African-American urban communities, and I'm just wondering how you can talk about that without talking about the redlining, contract buying, and war on drugs, and multiple other racist practices that have been happening across our country.
Yeah. So I wasn't trying to say these were the only causes, and there are no doubt a whole variety of problems. I was, in a sense, trying to draw a link between the problems of a community in the past and the problems of another community which doesn't face some of those problems that you talked about, but is experiencing the same kind of social breakdown, and arguing, therefore, that these breakdowns were in many ways a significant part of it, not the entire part, was also economic hardship. And sometimes you can get some way in resolving the issues by bringing economic activity back in a serious way to the communities.
Time for one more question.
So I'm almost done with your book, but I haven't fully finished it, and I'd like to ask, you live in Chicago, you're aware of the world that we all live in, and a lot of the prescriptions that you put towards the end of your book are on a local policy level, right? Things like changes to the way that we do schooling, or changes to the tax codes so that it incentivizes different kinds of behavior. What are 3 things that we, as residents of Chicago, who are interested enough to come to this lecture can do to build community in our own communities?
That's a great question, and you know, the last part of the book is my attempt to say this is not an insurmountable sort of hill, that there are communities that have done this, and here are some of the things that they have done. Some people, when they read that, say this is all small, you know, it's milk toast. It's too simple and too small. Where's the big revolutionary move? And to some extent, I think the big revolutionary move is not just Chicago-based. It's the broader idea that drove this country, which is much more decentralization of power. Over time, many more things have gotten caught up in the regulations. There's very little that can be done, you know, locally without having to deal with some of those other things. So it's a broader philosophy that can we enable the communities to do more? First, by empowering them. Second, by helping them hold on to their people, their good people, so that the good people don't all leave when the community is failing, because that's the time when the community needs them the most. And third, how do we get more resources to the community and make sure those resources are well used? Not so much by monitoring from top down, but monitoring from bottom up, that the community itself monitors how those resources. And I think this package could work more generally, not just in Chicago. There are many things that Chicago does, which should be a model for other, you know, other parts of the country. For example, and I know many of you are concerned about Chicago schools, but one of the things that Chicago schools have tried to do, the public schools, is not have that elite model where, you know, only 6% or 7% of minorities, apart from the Asian minority, get into the Stuyvesant Public School in New York. That is, there's a more broad-based opportunity to get into some of the magnet schools, etc., in this city, so that more children have a chance at great success in academia. But so I think there are lessons that can be learned from everywhere. But I would say for all communities, these three aspects: one, more empowerment of the local versus the state, city, state, national. Second, new methods to keep people here. One of the things that I throw out is, you know, in the same way as people who work for the government for more than 10 years get their student loans forgiven, could we think about such a scheme for people who go back to impoverished, relatively impoverished communities and work there for the betterment of the community, especially people with good college degrees? Could they get their loans forgiven? That would be one way of retaining people in the community. And the third is, how do we ensure that funding is decentralized a lot more so that you have the ability to decide in your ward what kinds of roads can be. Now, it's as I said, it's a menu which holds together. You need control over that so that, you know, the old corruption doesn't come back. But that needs community engagement. And communities don't get engaged if they think there's nothing they can do. So it's all a package that works together.
Well, join me in thanking Professor Rajan for being here with us tonight, and thank you for attending.
What a great presentation.